Good evening, pretty shiny peoples. All right. Um, so I know that this is a long series and it is going to take a long, long time to get through this series. But I am thinking about after this series a more interactive kind of experience. Not that everybody has to participate. Um, and I'll talk more about it, well, months and months and months from now because this is going to take a long time to get through. But if anybody would like to participate, and let me assure you, it is a book club project, it's not like a separate project. But if anybody would like to participate, I am willing to do pre recorded, it does not have to be live. So there's that. And B, I will need 9 to 10 people to make this project. So, um yeah, if anybody's interested in maybe having after this very long series a more interactive book club experience, please let me know because I think it would be kind of fun, but I can't do it by myself if I need 9 to 10 people. So, there's that. Um as always, I am sorry if Super Munchkin calls, if the dogs bark, if the puppy plays with the squeaky toy, any of that, my apologies. Thank you for your understanding and please bear with me and all of that good stuff. One moment. My apologies. I had to find where I put my water because we were not going to make it very far without it. Okay. Oh, also, as always, I may or may not stream after. I will say chances are way, way, way more likely that I will stream this time. Just because I ran into a video earlier that cracked me the fuck up. So, yeah, I might. I might. If not, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. I might go hang out with my mom tomorrow, actually. But anyway, on to tonight's reading. We are on book 2, still on Drawing of the Three. And this is not even the longest book in the series. Like I said, this is going to be a very, very long series. So, Tobin, you have a sneak peek of the future project because I mentioned it in the Weald. So, you have a sneak peek at what I'm thinking about. Other people don't, and I don't want to talk about it until I know more about whether or not it's even going to be feasible. So, but there's that. Okay. So this section is called Shuffle. The time following that night was broken time for Roland, time that didn't really exist as time at all. What he remembered was only a series of images, moments, conversations without context, images flashing past like one-eyed jacks and trays and nines and the bloody black bitch queen of spiders in a card sharp's wrap. And I already got tongue-tied this soon in. Queen of spiders in a card sharp's rapid shuffle. Later on, he asked Eddie how long that time had lasted, but Eddie didn't know either. Time had been destroyed for both of them. There was no time in hell, and each of them was in his own private hell. Roland the hell of the fever and infection, and Eddie the hell of withdrawal. It was less than a week, Eddie said. It's all I know for sure. How do you know that? A week's worth of pills was all I had to give you. After that, you were going to have to do one thing or the other on your own. Get well or die? Right. There's a gunshot as twilight draws down to dark, a dry crack and pinging on the inevitable and inequitable sound of the breakers dying on the desolate beach. Blam! He smelt a whiff of gunpowder. Trouble, the gunslinger thinks weakly, and gropes for the revolvers that aren't there. Oh no, it's the end, it's. But there's no more, as something starts to smell. Shuffle. Good in the dark. Something after all this long, dry time, something is cooking. It's not just the smell. He can hear the snap and pop of twigs, can see the faint orange flicker of a campfire. Sometimes when the sea breeze gusts, he smells fragrant smoke as well as the mouth-watering other smell. Food, he thinks. My God, am I hungry? If I'm hungry, maybe I'm getting well. Eddie, he tries to say, but his voice is all gone. His throat hurts so bad. Um, we should have brought some Aston, too, he thinks, and then tries to laugh. All the drugs for him, none for Eddie. Eddie appears. He got a tin plate, one the gunslinger would know anywhere. It came, after all, from his own purse. On it are streaming chunks of whitish pink meat. What, he tries to ask, and nothing comes out but a squeaky little farting sound. Eddie reads the shape of his lips. I don't know, he says crossly. All I know is it didn't kill me. Eat it, damn you. He sees Eddie is very pale. Eddie is shaking, and he smells something coming from Eddie that is either shit or death, and he knows Eddie is in a bad way. He reaches out a groping hand, wanting to give comfort, and Eddie strikes it away. I'll feed you, he says crossly. Fucked if I know why. I ought to kill you. I would. I didn't think that if you could get through into my world once, maybe you could do it again. Eddie looks around. And if it wasn't that, I'd be alone. Except for then. He looks back at Roland, and a fit of shuddering runs through him. It is so fierce that he almost spills the chunks of meat on the tin plate. At last it passes. Eat, goddamn you. And the gunslinger eats. The meat is more than not bad. The meat is delicious. He manages 3 pieces, and then everything blurs into a new shuffle. Effort to speak, but all he can do is whisper. The cup of Eddie's ear is pressed against his lips, except every now and then it shudders away as Eddie goes through one of his spasms. He says it again. North. Up. Up the beach. How do you know? Just know, he whispers. Eddie looks at him. You're crazy, he says. The gunslinger smiles and tries to black out, but Eddie slaps him, and slaps him hard. Roland's blue eyes fly open, and for a moment they are so alive and electric, Eddie looks uneasy. Then his lips draw back in a smile that is mostly snarl. Yeah, you can drone off, he says. But first, you gotta take your dope. It's time. Sun says it is anyway, I guess. I was never no Boy Scout, so I don't know for sure, but I guess it's close enough for government work. Open wide, Roland. Open wide for Dr. Eddie, you kidnapping fuck. The gunslinger opens his mouth like a baby for the breast, and Eddie puts 2 of the pills in his mouth and then slops fresh water carelessly into Roland's mouth. Roland guesses it must be from a hill stream somewhere to the east. It might be poison. Eddie wouldn't know fair water from foul. On the other hand, Eddie seems fine himself, and there's really no choice, is there? No. He swallows, coughs, and nearly strangles while Eddie looks at him indifferently. Roland reaches for him. Eddie tries to draw away. The gunslinger's bull-shooter eyes command him. Roland draws him close, so close he can smell the stink of Eddie's sickness, and Eddie can smell the stink of his. The combination sickens and compels them both. Only 2 choices here, Roland whispers. Don't know how it is in your world, but only 2 choices here. Stand and maybe live, or die on your knees with your head down and stink of your own armpits in your nose. Nothing. He hecks out a cough. Nothing to me. Who are you? Eddie screams at him. Your destiny, Eddie, the gunslinger whispers. Why don't you just eat shit and die? Eddie asks him. Then the gunslinger tries to speak, but before he can, he floats off as the cards. Blam! Roland opens his eyes on a billion stars wheeling through the blackness, then closes them again. He doesn't know what's going on, but he thinks everything's okay. The deck's still moving, the cards still shuffle. More of the sweet, tasty chunks of meat. He feels better. Eddie looks better too, but he also looks worried. They're getting closer, he said. They may be ugly, but they ain't completely stupid. They know what I've been doing. Somehow they know, and they don't dig it. Every night they get a little closer. It might be smart to move on when daybreak comes, if you can, or it might be the last daybreak we ever see. I did not intend to mute. My apologies. Let me go back a little. Uh, or it might be the last daybreak we ever see. What? This is not exactly a whisper, but a husk somewhere between a whisper and real speech. Them, Eddie says and gestures toward the beach. Data chap, data chum, and all that shit. I think they're like us, Roland. All for eating, but not too big on getting eaten. Suddenly, in an utter blast of horror, Roland realizes what the whitish pink chunks of meat Eddie was feeding him have been. He cannot speak. Revulsion robs him of what little voice he has managed to get back, but Eddie sees everything he wants to say on his face. What did you think I was doing? He nearly snarls, calling Red Lobster for takeout. They're poison, Roland whispers. That's why. Yeah, that's why you're hors de combat. What I'm trying to keep you from being, Roland, my friend, is hors d'oeuvres as well. As far as poison goes, rattlesnakes are poison, but people eat them. Rattlesnake tastes real good, like chicken. I read that somewhere. They look like lobsters to me, so I decided to take a chance. What else were we gonna eat? Dirt? I shot one of the fuckers and cooked the living Christ out of it. There wasn't anything else. And actually, they taste pretty good. I've been shooting one a night just after the sun starts to go down. They're not really lively until it gets completely dark. I never saw you turning this stuff down. Eddie smiles. I like to think maybe I got one of the ones that ate Jack. I like to think I'm eating that dink. It like eases my mind, you know? One of them ate part of me too. The gunslinger's husks out 2 fingers, 1 toe. That's also cool. Eddie keeps smiling. His face is pallid and shark-like. But some of that ill look has gone now, and the smell of shit and death, which has hung around him like a shroud, seems to be going away. Fuck yourself, the gunslinger husks. Roland shows a flash of spirit. Maybe you ain't gonna die after. Eddie. Roland shows a flash of spirit. Eddie cries. Maybe you ain't gonna die after all, darling. I think that's marvelous. Live, Roland says. The husk has become a whisper again. The fish hooks are returning to his throat. Yeah? Eddie looks at him, then nods and answers his own question. Yeah, I think you mean to. Once I thought you were going, and once I thought you were gone. Now it looks like you're going to get better. The antibiotics are helping, I guess, but mostly I think you're hauling yourself up. What for? Why the fuck do you keep trying so hard to keep alive on this scuzzy beach? Tower, he mouths, because now he can't even manage a husk. You and your fucking tower, Eddie says, and starts to turn away and then turns back, surprised as Roland's hand clamps on his arm like a manacle. They look into each other's eyes, and Eddie says, all right, all right. North, the gunslinger mouths. North, I told you. Has he told him that? He thinks so, but it's lost. Lost in the shuffle. How do you know? Eddie screamed at him in sudden frustration. He raises his fists as if to strike Roland, and then lowers them. I just know. So why do you waste my time and energy asking me foolish questions? He wants to reply. But before he can, the cards shuffle. Being dragged along, bounced and bumped, his head lolling helplessly from one side to the other, bound to some kind of weird travois by his own gun belts, and he can hear Eddie Dean singing a song which is so weirdly familiar. He at first believes this must be a delirium dream. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. Where did you hear that? He wants to ask. Did you hear me singing it, Eddie? And where are we? But before he can ask anything, shuffle. Court would bash the kid's head in if he saw that contraption, Roland thinks, looking at the travois upon which he spent the day, and laughs. It isn't much of a laugh. It sounds like one of those waves dropping its load of stones on the beach. He doesn't know how far they have come, but it's far enough for Eddie to be totally bushed. He's sitting on a rock in the lengthening light with one of the gunslinger's revolvers in his lap and a half-full water skin to one side. There's a small bulge in his shirt pocket. These are the bullets from the back of the gun belts, the diminishing supply of good bullets. Eddie has tied these up in a piece of his own shirt. The main reason the supply of good bullets is diminishing so fast is because one of every 4 or 5 has also turned out to be a dud. Eddie, who has been nearly dozing, now looks up. What are you laughing about? He asks. The gunslinger waves a dismissive hand and shakes his head. Because he's wrong, he realizes. Court wouldn't bash Eddie for the travois, even though it was an odd, lame-looking thing. Roland thinks it might even be possible that Court might grunt some word of compliment, such a rarity that the boy to whom it happened hardly ever knew how to respond. He was left gaping like a fish just pulled from a cook's barrel. The man's supports were 2 cottonwood branches of approximately the same length and thickness. A blowdown, the gunslinger presumed. He had used smaller branches as supports, attaching them to the support poles with crazy conglomerations of stuff. Gun belts, the glue string that held the devil powder to his chest, even the rawhide thong from the gunslinger's hat, and Eddie's own sneaker laces. He had laid the gunslinger's bedroll over the supports. Court would not have struck him because, sick as he was, Eddie had at least done more than squat on his hunkers and bewail his fate. He had made something, had tried. And Court might have offered one of his abrupt, almost grudging compliments because, crazy as the thing looked, it worked. The long tracks stretching back down the beach to a point they seemed to come together at the rim of perspective proved that. You see any of them? Eddie asks. The sun is going down, beating an orange path across the water, and so the gunslinger reckons he's been out better than 6 hours this time. He feels stronger. He sits up and looks down to the water. Neither the beach nor the land sweeping to the western slope of the mountains have changed much. He can see small variations of landscape, and detritus, a small seagull, for instance, lying in a little heap of blowing feathers on the sand about 20 yards to the left and 30 or so closer to the water. But these aside, they might as well be right where they started. No, the gunslinger says. Then, yes, there's one. He points, and Eddie squints, then nods. As the sun sinks lower and the orange track begins to look more and more like blood, the first of the lobstrosities come tumbling out of the waves and begin crawling up the beach. 2 of them race clumsily toward the dead gull. The winner pounces on it, rips it open, and begins to stuff the rotting remains into its maw. Did it chick? It asks. Dumma chum? Responds the loser. Dada kablam! Roland's gun puts an end to the second creature's questions. Eddie walks down to it and grabs it by the back, keeping a weary eye on its fellow as he does so. The other offers no trouble, however. It is busy with the gull. Eddie brings his kill back. It is still twitching, raising and lowering its claws, but soon enough it stops moving. The tail arches one final time, then simply drops instead of flexing downward. The boxer's claws hang limp. Dinner will soon be served, master, Eddie says. You have your choice, fillet of creepy crawler or fillet of creepy crawler. Which strikes your fancy, master? I don't understand you, the gunslinger said. Sure you do, Eddie said. You just don't have any sense of humor. What happened to it? Shot off in one war or another, I guess. Eddie smiles at that. You look and sound a little more alive tonight, Roland. I am, I think. Well, maybe you could even walk for a while tomorrow. I'll tell you very frankly, my friend, dragging you is the pits and shits. I'll try. You do that. You look a little better, too, Roland ventures. His voice cracks on the last two words like the voice of a young boy. If I don't stop talking soon, he thought, I won't be able to talk at all again. I guess I'll live. He looks at Roland expressionlessly. You'll never know how close it was a couple of times, though. Once I took one of your guns and put it against my head, cocked it, held it there for a while, and then took it away, eased the hammer down, and shoved it back in your holster. Another night, I had a convulsion. I think that was the second night, but I'm not sure. He shakes his head and says something the gunslinger both does and doesn't understand. Michigan seems like a dream to me now. Although his voice is down to the husky murmur again, and he knows he shouldn't be talking at all, the gunslinger has to know one thing. What stopped you from pulling the trigger? Well, this is the only pair of pants I've got, Eddie says. The last second, I thought if I pulled the trigger and it was one of those dud shells, I'd never get up the guts to do it again. And once you shit your pants, you gotta wash 'em right away or live with the stink forever. Henry told me that. He said he learned it in Nam. And since it was night time and Lester the lobster was out, not to mention all his friends. But the gunslinger is laughing hard, and although only an occasional cracked sound actually escapes his lips, smiling a little himself, Eddie says, I think maybe you only got your sense of humor shot off up to the elbow in that war. He gets up, meaning to go to the slope to where there will be fuel for a fire, Roland supposes. Wait, he whispers, and Eddie looks at him. Why? Really? I guess because you needed me. If I killed myself, you would have died. Later on, really after you're really on your feet again, I may, like, re-examine my options. He looks around and sighs deeply. There may be a Disneyland or Coney Island somewhere in your world, Roland, but what I've seen of it so far really doesn't interest me much. He starts away, pauses, and looks back again at Roland. His face is somber, although some of the sickly pallor has left it. The shakes have become no more than occasional tremors. Sometimes you really don't understand me, do you? No, the gunslinger whispers. Sometimes I don't. Then I'll elucidate. There are people who need people to need them. The reason you don't understand is because you're not one of those people. You'd use me and then toss me away like a paper bag if that's what it came down to. God fucked you, my friend. You're just smart enough so it would hurt you to do that, and just hard enough so you'd go ahead and do it anyway. You wouldn't be able to help yourself. If I was lying on the beach there and screaming for help, you'd walk over me if I was between you and your goddamn tower. Isn't that pretty close to the truth? Roland says nothing, only watches Eddie. But not everyone is like that. There are people who need people to need them. Like the Barbra Streisand song. Corny but true. It's just another way of being hooked through the bag. Eddie gazes at him. But when it comes to that, you're clean, aren't you? Roland watches him. Except for your tower. Eddie utters a short laugh. You're a tower junkie, Roland. Which war was it? Roland whispers. What? The one where you got your sense of nobility and purpose shot off. Eddie recoils, as if Roland has reached out and slapped him. I'm gonna go get some water, he says shortly. Keep an eye on the creepy crawlers. We come a long way today, but I still don't know if they talk to each other or not. He turned away then, but not before Roland has seen the last red rays of sunset reflected on his wet cheeks. Roland turns back to the beach and watches, The Lobstrosities crawl and question, question and crawl, but both activities seem aimless. They have some intelligence, but not enough to pass on information to others of their kind. God doesn't always dish it in your face, Roland thinks. Most times, but not always. Eddie returns with wood. Well, he asks, what do you think? We're all right, the gunslinger croaks, and Eddie starts to say something, but the gunslinger is tired now and lies back and looks at the first stars peeking through the canopy of the violet sky and shuffle. In the 3 days that followed, the gunslinger progressed steadily back to health. The red lines creeping up his arms first reversed their direction, then faded, and then disappeared. On the next day, he sometimes walked and sometimes let Eddie drag him. On the day following, he didn't need to be dragged at all. Every hour or two, they simply sat for a period of time until the watery feeling went out of his legs. It was during these rests and in those times after dinner had been eaten, but before the fire had burned all the way down and they went to sleep, the gunslinger heard about Henry and Eddie. He remembered wondering what had happened to make their brothering so difficult, but after Eddie had began, haltingly and with that sort of resentful anger that proceeds from deep pain, the gunslinger could have stopped it. Could have told him, don't bother, Eddie. I understand everything. Except that wouldn't have helped Eddie. Eddie wasn't talking to help Henry because Henry was dead. He was talking to bury Henry for good, and to remind himself that although Henry was dead, he, Eddie, wasn't. So the gunslinger listened and said nothing. The gist was simple. Eddie believed he had stolen his brother's life. Henry also believed this. Henry might have believed it on his own, or he might have believed it because he so frequently heard their mother lecturing Eddie on how much both she and Henry had sacrificed for him. So Eddie could be as safe as anyone could be in this jungle of a city. So he could be happy as anyone could be in this jungle of a city. So he wouldn't end up like his poor sister that he didn't even hardly remember because she had been so beautiful. God love her. She was with the angels, and that was undoubtedly a wonderful place to be, but she didn't want Eddie to be with the angels just yet. Run over in the road by some crazy drunken driver like his sister, or cut up by some crazy junkie kid for the 25 cents in his pocket and left with his guts running out all over the sidewalk. And because she didn't think Eddie wanted to be with the angels yet. He just better listen to what his big brother said and do what his big brother said to do, and always remember that Henry was making a loving sacrifice. Eddie told the gunslinger he doubted if his mother knew some of the things they had done, filching comic books from the candy store on Rincon Avenue or smoking cigarettes behind the bonded electroplate factory on Coho Street. Once they saw a Chevrolet with the keys in it, and although Henry barely knew how to drive, he was 16 then, Eddie 8, he had crammed his brother into the car and said they were going to New York City. Eddie was scared and crying. Henry's scared too and mad at Eddie, telling him to shut up, telling him to stop being such a fucking baby. He had $10 and Eddie had 3 or 4. They could go to the movies all fucking day and then catch a Pelham train and be back before their mother had time to put supper on the table and wonder where they were. But Eddie kept crying, and near the Queensboro Bridge they saw a police car on a side street, and although Eddie was pretty sure the cop in it hadn't even been looking their way, he said yeah. He said yeah when Henry asked him in a harsh, quavering voice if Eddie thought that the bull had seen them. Henry turned white and pulled over so fast that he had almost amputated a fire hydrant. He was running down the block while Eddie, now in a panic himself, was still struggling with the unfamiliar door handle. Henry stopped, came back, and hauled Eddie out of the car. He also slapped him twice. Then they had walked. Well, actually, they slunk all the way back to Brooklyn. It took them most of the day, and when their mother asked him why they looked so hot and sweaty and tired out, Henry said it was because he'd spent most of the day teaching Eddie how to go one-on-one on the basketball court at the playground around the block. Then some big kids came and they had to run. Their mother kissed Henry and beamed at Eddie. She asked if he didn't have the bestest big brother in the world, and Eddie agreed with her. This was honest agreement, too. He thought he did. He was as scared as I was that day, Eddie told Roland as they sat and watched the last of the day dwindle from the water. where soon the only light would be that reflected from the stars. Scared her, really, because he thought that cop saw us and I knew he didn't. That's why he ran. But he came back. That's the important part. He came back. Roland said nothing. You see that, don't you? Eddie was looking at Roland with harsh, questioning eyes. I see. He was always scared, but he always came back. Roland thought it would have been better for Eddie, maybe better for both of them in the long run, if Henry had just kept showing his heels that day, or on one of the others. But people like Henry never did. People like Henry always came back, because people like Henry did know how to use. First, they changed trust into need, and then they changed need into a drug, and once that was done, what was Eddie's word for it? Push? Yes, they pushed it. I think I'll turn in, the gunslinger said. The next day, Eddie went on, but Roland already knew it all. Henry hadn't played sports in high school because Henry couldn't stay after for practice. Henry had to take care of Eddie. The fact that Henry was scrawny and uncoordinated and didn't much care for sports in the first place had nothing to do with it, of course. Henry would have made a wonderful baseball pitcher or one of those basketball jumpers, their mother assured them both time and time again. Henry's grades were bad because he needed to repeat a number of subjects, but that wasn't because Henry was stupid. Eddie and Mrs. Dean both knew Henry was just as smart as lickety-split, but Henry had to spend the time he should have spent studying or doing homework taking care of Eddie. The fact that this usually took place in the Dean living room, with both boys sprawled on the sofa watching TV or wrestling around on the floor, somehow seemed not to matter. The bad grades meant Henry hadn't been able to be accepted into anything but NYU, and they couldn't afford it because of the bad grades. Um, and because the bad grades precluded any scholarships. And then Henry got drafted, and then it was Vietnam, where Henry got most of his knee blown off. And the pain was bad, and the drug they gave him for it had a heavy morphine base, and when he was better, they weaned him from drugs, only they didn't do such a good job because when Henry got back to New York, there was still a monkey on his back. A hungry monkey, waiting to be fed, and after a month or two, he had gone out to see a man. And it had been about 4 months later, less than a month after their mother died, when Eddie first saw his brother snorting some white powder off a mirror. Eddie assumed it was coke. Turned out it was heroin. And if you traced it all the way back, whose fault was it? Roland said nothing, but heard the voice of Court in his mind. Fault always lies in the same place, my fine babies, with him weak enough to lay blame. When he discovered the truth, Eddie had been shocked, then angry. Henry had responded by promising to quit snorting, but by telling Eddie he didn't blame him for being mad. He knew Nom had turned him into a worthless shitbag. He was weak. He would leave, and that was the best thing. Eddie was right. The last thing he needed was a filthy junkie around messing up the place. He just hoped Eddie wouldn't blame him too much. He had gotten weak, he admitted it. Something in Nom had made him weak, had rotted him out the same way moisture rotted the laces of your sneakers and the elastics of your underwear. There was also something in Nom that apparently rotted out your heart, Henry told him tearily. He just hoped that Eddie would remember all the years he had tried to be strong. For Eddie. And for Mom. So Henry tried to leave, and Eddie, of course, couldn't let him. Eddie was consumed with guilt. Eddie had seen the scared horror that had once been an unmarked leg, or the scarred horror that had once been an unmarked leg, a knee that was now more Teflon than bone. They had a screaming match in the hall. Henry standing there in an old pair of khakis with his packed duffel bag in one hand and purple rings under his eyes. Eddie wearing nothing but a pair of yellow jockey shorts. Henry saying, "You don't need me around, Eddie, I'm poison to you, and I know it." And Eddie yelling back, "You ain't going nowhere. Get your ass back inside." And that's how it went until Mrs. McGursky came out of her place and yelled, "Go or stay. It's nothing to me, but you better decide one way or other pretty quick or I'm calling the police." Mrs. McGursky seemed about to add a few more admonishments, but just then she saw that Eddie was wearing nothing but a pair of skivvies, and she added, "And you're not decent, Eddie Dean," before popping back inside. It was like watching a Jack in the Box in reverse. Eddie looked at Henry. Henry looked at Eddie. Looked like Angel Baby done put on a few pounds, Henry said in a low voice, and then they were howling with laughter, holding on to each other and pounding each other, and Henry came back inside, and about 2 weeks later, Eddie was snorting the stuff too, and he couldn't understand why the hell he had made such a big deal out of it. After all, it was only snorting shit. It got you off, and as Henry, who Eddie would eventually come to think of as the great sage and eminent junkie, said, "In a world that was clearly going to hell head first, what was so low about getting high?" Time passed. Eddie didn't say how much. The gunslinger didn't ask. He guessed that Eddie knew there were 1,000 excuses for getting high, but no reasons, and that he had kept his habit pretty well under control, and that Henry had also managed to keep his under control. Not as well as Eddie, but enough to keep from coming completely unraveled. Because whether or not Eddie understood the truth, down deep, Roland believed Eddie did. Henry must have. Their positions had reversed themselves. Now Eddie held Henry's hand, crossing the street. The day came when Eddie caught Henry not snorting, but skin popping. There had been another hysterical argument, an almost exact repeat of the first one, except it had been in Henry's bedroom. It ended in almost the same way, with Henry weeping and offering the implacable, inarguable defense that was utter surrender and utter admission. Eddie was right. He wasn't fit to live, not fit to eat garbage from the gutter. He would go. Eddie would never have to see him again. He just hoped he would remember all the. It faded into a drone that wasn't much different from the rocky sound of the breaking waves as they trudged up the beach. Roland knew the story and said nothing. It was Eddie who didn't know the story, and Eddie was really clear-headed for the first time in maybe 10 years or more. Eddie wasn't telling the story to Roland. Eddie was finally telling the story to himself. That was right. That was all right. So far as the gunslinger could see, time was something they had a lot of. Talk was one way to fill it. Eddie said he was haunted by Henry's knee, the twisted scar tissue up and down his leg. Of course, that was all healed now. Henry barely even limped, except when he and Eddie were quarreling. Then the limp always seemed to get worse. He was haunted by all the things Eddie had given up for him, and haunted by something much more pragmatic. Henry wouldn't last out on the streets. He would be like a rabbit let loose in a jungle filled with tigers. On his own, Henry would wind up in jail or Bellevue before the week was out. So he begged, and Henry finally did him the favor of consenting to stick around, and 6 months after that, Eddie also had a golden arm. From that moment, things had begun to move in the steady and inevitable downward spiral which had ended with Eddie's trip to the Bahamas and Roland's sudden intervention in his life. Another man, less pragmatic and more introspective than Roland, might have asked, to himself if not right out loud, why this one? Why this man to start? Why a man who seems to promise weakness or strangeness or even outright doom? Not only did the gunslinger never ask the question, it never even formulated itself in his mind. Cuthbert would have asked. Cuthbert had questioned everything, had been poisoned with questions, had died with one in his mouth. Now they were gone, all gone. Court's last gunslingers, the 13 survivors of a beginning class that had numbered 56, were all dead. All dead but Roland. He was the last gunslinger going steadily on in a world that had grown stale and sterile and empty. 13, he remembered Court saying on the day before the presentation ceremonies. This is an evil number. And on the following day, for the first time in 30 years, Court had not been present at the ceremonies. His final crop of pupils had gone to his cottage to first kneel at his feet, presenting defenseless necks, then to rise and receive his congratulatory kiss and to allow him to load their guns for the first time. 9 weeks later, Court was dead. Of poison, some said. 2 years after his death, the final bloody civil war had begun. The Red Slaughter had reached the last bastion of civilization. Light and sanity had taken away what all of them had assumed was so strong with the casual ease of a wave taking a child's castle of sand. So he was the last. And perhaps he had survived because the dark romance in his nature was overset by his practicality and simplicity. He understood that only three things mattered: mortality, Ka, and the tower. And I just lost myself for no reason because I looked up for my water. I'm sorry. One moment. Those were enough things to think about. Eddie finished his tale around 4 o'clock on the third day of their northward journey up the featureless beach. The beach itself never seemed to change. If a sign of progress was wanted, it could only be obtained by looking left to the east. There, the jagged peaks of the mountains had begun to soften and slump a bit. It was possible that if they went north far enough, the mountains would become rolling hills. With his story told, Eddie lapsed into silence, and they walked without speaking for half an hour or longer. Eddie kept stealing little glances at him. Roland knew Eddie wasn't aware that he was picking these glances up. He was still too much in himself. Roland also knew what Eddie was waiting for: a response. Some kind of response, any kind. Twice Eddie opened his mouth only to close it again. Finally, he asked what the gunslinger had known he would ask. So, what do you think? I think you're here. Eddie stopped, fisted, hands planted on his hips. That's all? That's it? That's all I know, the gunslinger replied. His missing fingers and toes throbbed and itched. He wished for some of the Aston from Eddie's world. You don't have any opinion on what the hell it all means? The gunslinger might have held up his subtracted right hand and said, "Think about what this means, you silly idiot." But it no more crossed his mind to say this than it had to ask why it was Eddie, out of all the people in all the universes that might exist. "It's Ka," he said, facing Eddie patiently. "What's Ka?" Eddie's voice was truculent. "I never heard of it. Except you say it twice, you come out with the baby word for shit." "I don't know about that," the gunslinger said. "Here it means duty or destiny or, in the Vulgate, a place you must go." Eddie managed to look dismayed, disgusted, and amused all at the same time. "Then say it twice, Roland, because the word like that sounds like shit to this kid." The gunslinger shrugged. "I don't discuss philosophy. I don't study history. All I know is what's past is past and what's ahead is ahead. The second is Ka and takes care of itself." "Yeah?" Eddie looked northward. "Well, all I see ahead is about 9 billion miles of this same fucking beach. If that's what's ahead, Ka and Kaka are the same thing. We might have enough good shells to pop 5 or 6 more of those lobster dudes, but then we're going to be down to chucking rocks at them. So where are we going?" Roland did wonder briefly if this was a question Eddie had ever thought to ask his brother. But to ask such a question would only be an invitation to a lot of meaningless argument. So he only cocked a thumb northward and said, "There, to begin with." Eddie looked and saw nothing but the same reach of shell and rock-studded gray shingle. He looked back at Roland, about to scoff, saw the serene certainty on his face, and looked again. He squinted. He shielded the right side of his face from the westering sun with his right hand. He wanted desperately to see something, anything. Shit, even a mirage would do. But there was nothing. "Crap on me all you want to," Eddie said slowly, "but I say it's a goddamn mean trick. I put my life on the line for you at Balazar's." "I know you did." The gunslinger smiled. a rarity that lit his face like a momentary flash of sunlight on a dismal, luring day. "That's why I've done nothing but square deal you, Eddie. It's there. I saw it an hour ago. At first, I thought it was only a mirage or wishful thinking, but it's there all right." Eddie looked again, looked until the water ran from the corner of his eyes. At last he said, "I don't see anything up ahead but more beach, and I got 20/20 vision. I don't know what that means. It means if there was something there to see, I'd see it." But Eddie wondered how much further than his own the gunslinger's blue bull shooter eyes could see. Maybe a little, maybe a lot. "You'll see it," the gunslinger said. "See what?" "We won't get there today, but if you see as well as you say, you'll see it before the sun hits the water. Unless you just want to stand here chin jawing, that is." "Caw," Eddie said in a musing voice. Roland nodded. "Caw." "Caw caw," Eddie said and laughed. "Come on, Roland. Let's take a hike. And if I don't see anything by the time the sun hits the water, you owe me a chicken dinner, or a Big Mac, or anything that isn't lobster. Come on." They started walking again, and it was at least a full hour before the sun's lower arc touched the horizon, when Eddie Dean began to see the shape in the distance. Vague, shimmering, indefinable, but definitely something. Something new. "Okay," he said. "I see it. You must have eyes like Superman." "Who?" "Never mind. You've got really incredible case of culture lag. You know it?" "What?" Eddie laughed. "Never mind. What is it?" "You'll see." The gunslinger started walking again before Eddie could ask anything else. 20 minutes later, Eddie thought he did see. 15 minutes after that, he was sure. The object on the beach was still 2, maybe 3 miles away, but he knew what it was. A door, of course. Another door. Neither of them slept well that night, and they were up and walking an hour before the sun cleared the eroding shapes of the mountains. They reached the door just as the morning sun's first rays, so sublime and so still, broke over them. Those rays lighted their stubbly cheeks like lamps. They made the gunslinger 40 again, and Eddie no older than Roland had been when he went out to fight Court with his hawk, David, as his weapon. This door was exactly like the first, except for what was writ upon it: The Lady of Shadows. "So," Eddie said softly, looking at the door which simply stood here with its hinges grounded in some unknown jam between one world or another, one universe and another. It stood with its graven message, real as rock and strange as starlight. "So," the gunslinger agreed. "Ka. Ka. Here is where you draw the second of your 3?" "It seems so." The gunslinger knew what was in Eddie's mind before Eddie knew it himself. He saw Eddie make his move before Eddie knew he was moving. He could have turned back and broken Eddie's arm in 2 places before Eddie knew it was happening, but he made no move. He let Eddie snake the revolver from his right holster. It was the first time in his life he had allowed one of his weapons to be taken from him without an offer of that weapon having first been made, yet he made no move to stop it. He turned and looked at Eddie equably, even mildly. Eddie's face was livid, strained. His eyes showed starry whites all the way around the irises. He held the heavy revolver in both hands, and still the muzzle rambled from side to side, centering, moving off, centering again, and then moving off again. "Open it," he said. "You're being foolish," the gunslinger said in the same mild voice. "Neither of us has any idea where that door goes. It needn't open on your universe, let alone upon your world. For all either of us know, the Lady of Shadows might have 8 eyes and 9 arms like Suvia. Even if it does open on your world, it might not be on the same time, long before you were born or long after you have died." Eddie smiled tightly. "Tell you what, Monty, I'm more than willing to trade the rubber chicken and this shitty seaside vacation for what's behind door number 2. "I don't understand you." "I know you don't. It doesn't matter. Just open the fucker." The gunslinger shook his head. They stood in the dawn, the door casting its slanted shadow toward the ebbing sea. "Open it!" Eddie cried. "I'm going with you. Don't you don't you get it? I'm going with you. That doesn't mean I won't come back. Maybe I will. I mean, probably I will. I guess I owe you that much. You've been square John with me down the line. Don't think I'm not aware of that fact. But while you get whoever this shadow babe is, I'm going to find the nearest Chicken Delight and pick me up some takeout. I think the 30-piece family pack should do for starters. You stay here. You think I don't mean it?" Eddie was shrill now, close to the edge. The gunslinger could almost see him looking down into the drifty depths of his own damnation. Eddie thumbed back the revolver's ancient hammer. The wind had fallen with the break of day and the ebb of the tide, and the click of the hammer as Eddie brought it to full cock was very clear. "You just try me." "I think I will," the gunslinger said. "I'll shoot you," Eddie screamed. "Caw," the gunslinger replied stolidly and turned to the door. He was reaching for the knob, but his heart was waiting to see if he would live or die. Caw. The Lady of the Shadows. Chapter 1. Detta and Odetta. Stripped of jargon, what Adler said was this: the perfect schizophrenic. If there was such a person, would be a man or woman not only unaware of the other personae, but one unaware that anything at all was amiss in his or her life. I'm gonna stop and pause right here. There was a point in time where DID was not separated from schizophrenia. It was kind of like when they were still discovering it, it was almost like they thought that DID was a like kind of like a symptom of schizophrenia. These are two separate things. This character is going to display both of those things. However, for some reason in this book, it is only referred to as schizophrenia. I know that that's not wholly accurate. That's what the author wrote, so that's what we're going to go with while I read. Okay. Continuing. Adler should have met Detta Walker and Odetta Holmes. Last gunslinger, Andrew said. He had been talking for quite a while, but Andrew always talked, and Odetta usually just let it flow over her mind the way you let warm water flow over your hair and face in the shower. This did more than catch her attention. It snagged it as if on a thorn. "I beg pardon." "Oh, it was just some column in the paper," Andrew said. "I don't know who wrote it. I didn't notice. One of those political fellas. Probably you'd know, Miss Holmes. I loved him, and I cried the night he was elected." She smiled, touched in spite of herself. Andrew said his ceaseless chatter was something he couldn't stop, wasn't responsible for, that it was just the Irish in him coming out, and most of it was nothing. Cluckings and chirrupings about relatives and friends she would never meet, half-baked political opinions, weird scientific commentary gleaned from any number of weird sources. Among other things, Andrew was a firm believer in flying saucers, which he called UFOs. But this touched her because she also cried the night he was elected. "But I didn't cry when that son of a bitch, pardon my French, Miss Holmes, when that son of a bitch Oswald shot him, and I hadn't cried since. And it's been, what, 2 months?" 3 months and 2 days, she thought. "Something like that, I guess." Andrew nodded. "Then I read this column in the Daily News. It might have been yesterday about how Johnson's probably going to do a pretty good job, but it won't be the same. The guy said America had seen the passage of the world's last gunslinger." "I don't think John Kennedy was that at all," Odetta said. And if her voice was sharper than the one Andrew was accustomed to hearing, which it must have been because she saw his eyes give a startled blink in the rearview mirror, a blink that was more like a wince. It was because she felt herself touched by this, too. It was absurd, but it was also a fact. There was something about that phrase, America has seen the passage of the world's last gunslinger, that rang deeply in her mind. It was ugly. It was untrue. John Kennedy had been a peacekeeper, not a leather-slapping Billy the Kid type. There that was more in the Goldwater line, but it also, for some reason, given her goosebumps. Well, the guy said there would be no shortage of shooters in the world, Andrew went on, regarding her nervously in the review mirror. He mentioned Jack Ruby for one, and Castro, and this fellow in Haiti. Duvalier, she said. Papa Doc. Yeah, him, and the Diem brothers are dead. Well, he said, Jack Kennedy was different, that's all. He said he would draw, but only if someone weaker needed him to draw, and only if there was nothing else to do. He said Kennedy was savvy enough to know that sometimes talking don't do no good. He said Kennedy knew if it's foaming at the mouth, you have to shoot it. His eyes continued to regard her apprehensively. Besides, it was just some column I read. The limo was gliding up Fifth Avenue now, headed toward Central Park West, the Cadillac emblem on the end of the hood cutting the frigid February air. Yes, Odetta said mildly, and Andrew's eyes relaxed a trifle. I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. You're a liar, a voice spoke up in her mind. This was a voice she heard quite often. She had even named it. It was the voice of the goad. You understand perfectly and agree completely. Lie to Andrew if you feel it necessary, but for God's sake, don't lie to yourself, woman. Yet part of her protested, horrified. In a world which had become a nuclear powder keg upon which nearly 1 billion people now sat, it was a mistake, perhaps one of suicidal proportions, to believe there was a difference between good shooters and bad shooters. There were too many shaky hands holding lighters near too many fuses. This was no world for gunslingers. If there had ever been a time for them, it had passed, hadn't it? She closed her eyes briefly and rubbed at her temples. She could feel one of her headaches coming on. Sometimes they threatened, like an ominous buildup of thunderheads on a hot summer afternoon, and then blew away. The ugly summer bruise sometimes simply slipped away in one direction or another, to stomp their thunders and lightnings into the ground of some other place. She thought, however, that this time the storm was going to happen. It would come complete with thunder, lightning, and a hail the size of golf balls. The streetlights marching up Fifth Avenue seemed much too bright. So how was Oxford, Miss Holmes? Andrew asked tentatively. Humid. February or not, it was very humid. She paused, telling herself she wouldn't say the words that were crowding up her throat like bile, that she would swallow them back down. To say them would be needlessly brutal. Andrew's talk of the world's last gunslinger had been just more of the man's endless prattling, but on top of everything else, it was just a bit too much and it came out anyway, which he had no business saying. Her voice sounded as calm and as resolute as ever, she supposed, but she was not fooled. She knew in a blurt when she heard one. The bail bondsman came very promptly, of course. He had been notified in advance. They held on to us as long as they could, nevertheless. And I held on as long as I could, but I guess they won that one, because I ended up wetting myself. She saw Andrew's eyes wince away again, and she wanted to stop and couldn't stop. It's what they want to teach you, you see, partly because it frightens you. I suppose, and a frightened person may not come down to their precious Southlands and bother them again, but I think most of them, even the dumb ones, and they are by all means not all dumb, know the change will come in the end no matter what they do, and so they take the chance to degrade you while they still can, to teach you you can be degraded. You can swear before God, Christ, and the whole company of saints that you will not soil yourself. But if they hold on to you long enough, of course you do. The lesson is that you're just an animal in a cage, and no more than that, no better than that, just an animal in a cage. So I wet myself. I can still smell dried urine and that damned holding cell. They think we are all descended from monkeys, you know. And that's exactly what I smell like to myself right now. A monkey? She saw Andrew's eyes in the rearview mirror and was sorry for the way his eyes looked. Sometimes your urine wasn't the only thing you couldn't hold. I'm sorry, Miss Holmes. No, she said, rubbing at her temples again. I am the one who is sorry. It's been a trying 3 days, Andrew. I should think so, he said in a shocked old maidish voice that made her laugh in spite of herself. But most of her wasn't laughing. She thought she had known what she was getting into, that she had fully anticipated how bad it could get. She had been wrong. A trying 3 days. Well, that was one way to put it. Another might be that her 3 days in Oxford, Mississippi had been a short season in hell, but there were some things you couldn't say. Some things you would die before saying, unless you were called upon to testify to them before the throne of God and Father Almighty, where she supposed even the truths that caused the hellish thunderstorms and that strange gray jelly between your ears. The scientist said that gray jelly was nevertheless, and if that wasn't a hoot and a half, she didn't know what was, must be admitted. I just want to get home and bathe, and sleep. Then I reckon I will be right as rain. Why, sure, that's just what you're going to be. Andrew wanted to apologize for something, and this is as close as he could come. And beyond this, he didn't want to risk further conversation. So the two of them rode back in unaccustomed silence to the gray Victorian block of apartments on the corner of 5th and Central Park South. A very exclusive gray Victorian block of apartments, and she supposed that made her a blockbuster. And she knew there were people in those poshy flats who would not speak to her unless they absolutely had to. And she didn't really care. Besides, she was above them, and they knew she was above them. It had occurred to her on more than one occasion that it must have galled some of them mightily, knowing there was inward at a nizzle living in the penthouse apartment of this fine staid old building where once the only black hands allowed had been clad in white gloves or perhaps the thin black leather ones of a chauffeur. She hoped it did gall them mightily, and scolded herself for being mean, for being unchristian, but she did wish it. She hadn't been able to stop this piss pouring into the crotch of her fine silk embroidered underwear, and she didn't seem to be able to stop this other flood of piss either. It was mean, it was unchristian, and almost as bad. No, worst. At least as far as the movement was concerned, it was counterproductive. They were going to win the rights they needed to win, and probably this year. Johnson, mindful of the legacy which had been left him by the slain president, and perhaps hoping to put another nail in the coffin of Barry Goldwater, would do more than oversee the passage of the Civil Rights Act. If necessary, he would ram it into law. So it was important to minimize the scarring and the hurt. There was more work to be done. Hate would not help do that work. Hate would, in fact, hinder it. But sometimes you went on hating just the same. Oxford Town had taught her that, too. Detta Walker had absolutely no interest in the movement and much more modest digs. She lived in the loft of a peeling Greenwich Village apartment building. Odetta didn't know about the loft, and Detta didn't know about the penthouse, and the only one left who suspected something was not quite right was Andrew Feeney, the chauffeur. He had begun working for Odetta's father when Odetta was 14 and Detta Walker hardly existed at all. Sometimes Odetta disappeared. These disappearances might be a matter of hours or days. Last summer she had disappeared for 3 weeks, and Andrew had been ready to call the police when Odetta called him one evening and asked him to bring the car around at 10 the next day. She planned to do some shopping, she said. It trembled on his lips to cry out, "Miss Holmes, where have you been?" But he had asked this before and had received only puzzled stares. Truly puzzled stares, he was sure, in return. "Right here," she would say. "Why, right here, Andrew. You've been driving me 2 or 3 places every day, haven't you? You aren't starting to go a little mushy in the head, are you?" Then she would laugh, and if she was feeling especially good, as she often seemed to feel after her disappearances, she would pinch his cheeks. "Very good, Miss Holmes," he had said. "10 it is. One moment." Sorry about that. That was a very strange noise coming from outside my door, and I thought maybe somebody had lost their dog and I was going to have to go find the owner. But it seems like one of the foxes was out early, so we're good. All right. Where were we? Um, Very good, Miss Holmes, he had said. 10 it is. That scary time she had gone for 3 weeks. Andrew had put down the phone, closed his eyes, and said a quick prayer to the Blessed Virgin for Miss Holmes' safe return. Then he had rung Miss Howard, the doorman at her building. "What time did she come in?" "Just about 20 minutes ago," Howard said. "Who brought her?" "Dunno." "You know how it is. Different car every time. Sometimes they park around the block and I don't see 'em at all. Don't even know she's back until I hear the buzzer and look out and I see it's her." Howard paused, then added, "She's got one hell of a bruise on her cheek." Howard had been right. It sure had been one hell of a bruise, and now it was getting better. Andrew didn't like to think what it might have looked like when it was fresh. Miss Holmes appeared promptly at 10 the next morning, wearing a silk sundress with spaghetti thin straps. This had been late July, and by then the bruise had started to yellow. She had made only a perfunctory effort to cover it with makeup, as if knowing that too much effort to cover it would only draw further attention to it. "How did you get that, Miss Holmes?" he asked. She laughed merrily. "You know me, Andrew, clumsy as ever. My hand slipped on the grab handle while I was getting out of the tub yesterday. I was in a hurry to catch the national news. I fell and banged the side of my face." She gauged his face. "You're getting ready to start blithering about doctors and examinations, aren't you? Don't bother answering. After all these years, I can read you like a book. I won't go, so you needn't bother asking. I'm just as fine as paint. Onward, Andrew. I intend to buy half of Saks, all of Gimbel's, and eat everything at Four Seasons in between." "Yes, Miss Holmes," he said, and smiled. It was a forced smile, and forcing it was not easy. That bruise wasn't a day old. It was a week old, at least. And he knew better anyway, didn't he? He had called her every night at 7 o'clock for the last week because if there was one time when you could catch Miss Holmes in her place, it was when the Huntley Brinkley report came on. Regular junkie for her news was Miss Holmes. He had done it every night, that was, except last night. Then he had gone over and wheeled the pass key from Howard. A conviction had been growing on him steadily that she had been in just the sort of accident she had described, had died. Only instead of getting a bruise or a broken bone, she had died, and died alone, and was lying up there dead right now. He had let himself in, heart thumping, feeling like a cat in the dark room crisscrossed with piano wires, only there had been nothing to be nervous about. There was a butter dish on the kitchen counter, and although the butter had been covered, it had been out long enough to be growing a good crop of mold. He got there at 10 minutes of 7 and had left by 5 after. In the course of his quick examination of the apartment, he had glanced into the bathroom. The tub had been dry, the towels neatly, even austerely arrayed, the room's many grab handles polished to a bright steel gleam that was unspotted with water. He knew the accident she had described had not happened, but Andrew had not believed she was lying either. She had believed what she had told him. He looked in the rearview mirror again and saw her rubbing her temples lightly with the tips of her fingertips. He didn't like it. He had seen her do that too many times before one of her disappearances. Andrew left the motor running so she could have the benefit of the heater, then went around to the trunk. He looked at her 2 suitcases with another wince. They looked as if petulant men with small minds and large bodies had kicked them relentlessly back and forth, damaging the bags in a way that did not quite dare damage Miss Holmes herself. Oh, wait. The way they might have damaged him, for instance, if he had been there. It wasn't just that she was a woman. She was a nizzle, an uppity northern nizzle, messin' where she had no business messin', and they probably figured a woman like that deserved just what she got. Thing was, she was also a rich nizzle. She was also a well known to the American public as Medgar Evers. The thing was, she was almost as well known to the American public as Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King. Thing was, she'd gotten her rich nizzle face on the cover of Time magazine, and it was a little harder to get away with sticking someone like that in the toolies and then saying, "What? No, sir, boss. We sure didn't see nobody look like that down here, did we, boys?" Thing was, it was a little harder to work yourself up to hurting a woman who was the only heir to Holmes Dental Industries when there were 12 Holmes plants in the sunny South, one of them just one county over from Oxford Town. Oxford Town. So they'd done to her suitcases what they didn't dare do to her. He looked at these mute indications of her stay in Oxford Town with shame and fury and love, emotions as mute as the scars on the luggage that had gone away looking smart and had come back looking dumb and thumped. He looked, temporarily unable to move, and his breath puffed out on the frosty air. Howard was coming out to help, but Andrew paused a moment longer before grasping the handles of the cases. "Who are you, Miss Holmes? Who are you really? Where do you go sometimes, and what do you do that seems so bad that you have to make up false history of missing hours or days, even to yourself?" And he thought something else in this moment before Howard arrived, something weirdly apt. Where's the rest of you? You want to quit thinking like that. If anyone around here was going to do any thinking like that, it would be Miss Holmes. But she doesn't, and so you don't need to either. Andrew lifted the bags out of the trunk and handed them to Howard, who asked in a low voice, "Is she all right?" "I think so," Andrew replied, also pitching his voice low. "Just tired is all. Tired all the way down to her roots." Howard nodded, took the battered suitcases, and started back inside. He paused only long enough to tip his cap to Odetta Holmes, who was almost invisible behind the smoked glass windows in a soft and respectful salute. When he was gone, Andrew took out the collapsed stainless steel scaffolding at the bottom of the trunk and began to unfold it. It was a wheelchair. Since August 19th, 1959, some 5.5 years before, the part of Odetta Holmes from the knees down had been as missing as those blank hours and days. Before the subway incident, Detta Walker had only been conscious a few times. There were like coral islands which look isolated to one above, but are in fact only nodes in the spine of a long archipelago which is mostly underwater. Odetta suspected Detta not at all, and Detta had no idea that there was a such person as Odetta. But Detta at least had a clear understanding that something was wrong. That someone was fucking with her life. Detta's imagination novelized all sorts of things which had happened when Detta was in charge of her body. Detta was not so clever. She thought she remembered things. Some things at least, but a lot of the time she didn't. Detta was at least partially aware of the blanks. She could remember the china plate. She could remember that. She could remember slipping it into the pocket of her dress, looking over her shoulder all the while to make sure the blue woman wasn't there peeking. She had to make sure because the china plate belonged to the blue woman. The china plate was Detta understood in some vague way, a force special. Detta took it for that why. Detta remembered taking it to a place she knew, although she didn't know how she knew, as the drawers, a smoking trash littered hole in the earth where she had once seen a burning baby with plastic skin. She remembered putting the plate carefully down on the gravelly ground and then starting to step on it and stomping, remembering taking off her plain cotton panties and putting them into the pocket where the plate had been, and then carefully slipping the first finger of her left hand carefully against the cut in her at the place where old stupid God had joined her and all the grindswoman imperfectly. But something about that place must be right, because she remembered the jolt, remembered the wanting to press, remembered not pressing, remembering how delicious her. Uh, why does Stephen King do this to me? At least he's not as bad as George R. Martin. Okay, where were we? Um, without the cotton panties in the way of it. Um, Wait, oh, wanting to press, remembering not pressing, remembering how delicious her vagina had been naked without the cotton panties in the way of it and the world, and she had not pressed, not until her shoe pressed, her black patent leather shoe, not until her shoe pressed down on the plate. Then she pressed on the cunt with her finger the way she was pressing the blue woman's four special china plate with her foot. She remembered the way the black patent leather shoe covered the delicate blue webbing on the edge of the plate. She remembered the press. Yes, she remembered pressing the drawers, pressing with fingers and foot. Remembered the delicious promise of finger and cut. Remembered that when the plate snapped with a brittle snap, a similar brittle pleasure had skewered upward from that cut in her guts like an arrow. She remembered the cry with which had broken her lips, an unpleasant cawing like the sound of a crow scarred from a corn patch. She could remember staring dully at the fragments of the plate and then taking the plain white cotton panties slowly out of her dress pocket and putting them on again. Step-ins, so she had heard them called in some time unhoused in memory and drifting loose like turves on a flood tide. Step-ins. Good, because first you stepped out to do your business and then you stepped back in. First one shiny patent leather shoes and then the other. Good. Panties were good. She could remember drawing them up her legs so clearly, drawing them past her knees, the scab on the left one almost ready to fall off and leave clean pink new baby skin. Yes, she could remember so clearly. It might not have been a week ago or yesterday, but only one single moment ago. She could remember how the waistband had reached the hem of her pretty dress, the clear contrast of the white cotton against the brown skin, like cream. Yes, like that. Cream from a pitcher caught suspended over coffee, the texture, the panties disappearing under the hem of the dress. Except then, the dress was burnt or orange, and the panties were not going up but down. But they were still white, but not cotton. They were nylon, cheap see through nylon panties, cheap in more ways than one, and she remembered stepping out of them. She remembered how they glimmered on the floor mat of the 46 Dodge DeSoto. Yes, how white they were, how cheap they were. Not anything dignified like underwear, but cheap panties. The girl was cheap, and it was good to be cheap, good to be on sale, to be on the block, not even like a whore, but like a good breed sow. She remembered no round china plate, but the round white face of a boy, some surprised, drunk fraternity boy. He was no china plate, but His face was as round as the blue woman's china plate had been, and there was webbing on his cheeks, and this webbing looked as blue as the webbing on the blue woman's plate. Uh, for special china plate had been. There was only because the neon was red. The neon was garish. In the dark, the neon from the roadhouse sign made the spreading blood from the places on his cheeks where she had clawed him look like blue. And and he had said, "Why did you? Why did you? Why did you?" And then he unrolled the window so he could get his face outside to puke, and she remembered hearing Dodie Stevens on the jukebox singing about tan shoes with pink shoelaces and a big Panama with a purple hat band. She remembered the sound of his puking was like gravel in a cement mixer, and his penis, which was moments before had been a livid exclamation point rising from the tufted tangle of his pubic hair, was collapsing into a weak white question mark. She remembered the hoarse gravel sounds of his vomiting stopped and then started again, and she thought, well, I guess he ain't made enough to lay this foundation yet. And laughing and pressing her finger, which now came equipped with a long shaped nail, against her vagina, which was bare, but no longer bare because it was overgrown with its own coarse, uh, briared tangle. And there had been the same brittle breaking snap inside her, and it was still as much pain as it was pleasure, but better, far better than nothing at all. And then he was grabbing blindly for her and saying in a hurt, breaking tone, "Oh, you goddamn niz- nizzle cunt." And she went on laughing just the same, dodging him easily and snatching up her panties and opening the door on her side of the car, feeling the last blind thud of his fingers on the back of her blouse as she ran into a May night that was redolent of early honeysuckle, red pink neon light stuttering off the gravel of some post war parking lot, stuffing her panties, her cheap, slick nylon panties, into the pocket of her dress. But into a purse jumbled, not into the pocket of her dress, but into a purse jumbled with teenagers' tearful conglomeration of cosmetics. She was running. The light was stuttering. And then she was 23, and it was not panties, but a rayon scarf, and she was casually slipping it into her purse as she walked along a counter in the nice notations section of Macy's. The scarf which sold at the time for $1.99. Cheap. Cheap like the white nylon panties. Cheap like her. The body she inhabited was that of a woman who had inherited millions, but that was not known and didn't matter. The scarf was white, the edging blue, and there was that same little breaking sense of pleasure as she sat in the back seat of the taxi and, oblivious of the driver, held the scarf in one hand looking at it fixedly, while her other hand crept up under her tweed skirt and beneath the leg band of her white panties, and that one long dark finger took care of business that needed to be taken care of in a single merciless stroke. So sometimes she wondered, in a distracted sort of way, where she was when she wasn't here. But mostly her needs were too sudden and pressing for any extended contemplation, and she simply fulfilled what needed to be fulfilled, did what needed to be done. Roland would have understood. Odetta could have taken a limo everywhere, even in 1959. Although her father was still alive and she was not as fabulously rich as she would become when he died in 1962, the money held in a trust for her had become hers on her 25th birthday, and she could do pretty much as she liked. But she cared very little for a phrase one of the conservative columnists had coined a year or two before, the phrase limousine liberal, and she was young enough not to want to be seen as one, even if she really was one. Not young enough or stupid enough to believe that a few pairs of faded jeans and khaki shirts she habitually wore in any real way changed her essential status, or riding the bus or the subway when she could have used the car. But she had not been self but she had been self-involved enough not to see Andrew's hurt and deep puzzlement. He liked her and thought it must be some sort of personal rejection, but young enough to still believe that the gesture could sometimes overcome, or at least overset truth. On the night of August 19th, 1959, she paid for the gesture with half her legs and half her mind. Odetta had been first tugged, then pulled, and finally caught up in the swell, which would eventually turn into a tidal wave. In 1957, when she became involved, the thing which eventually became known as the movement had no name. She knew some of the background, knew the struggle for equality had gone on not since the Emancipation Proclamation, but almost since the first boatload of slaves had been brought to America. To Georgia, in fact, the colony the British founded to get rid of their criminals and debtors. But for Odetta, it always seemed to begin in the same place, with the same three words: I'm not movin'. The place had been a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and the words had been spoken by a black woman named Rosalie Parks. And the place from which Rosalie Parks was not moving was from the front of the city bus to the back of the city bus, which was, of course, the Jim Crow part of the city bus. Much later, Odetta would sing We Shall Not Be Moved with the rest of them, and it always made her think of Rosalie Parks, and she never sang it without a sense of shame. It was so easy to sing We with your arms linked to the arms of a whole crowd. That was easy even for women with no legs. So easy to sing we, so easy to be we. There had been no we on that bus. That bus that must have stank of ancient leather and years of cigar and cigarette smoke, that bus with the curved and cards saying things like Lucky Strike, LMSFT, and attend the church of your choice for heaven's sake, and drink Ovaltine. Well, you'll see what we mean, and Chesterfield, 21. Great tobacco, make 21 wonderful smokes. No, we, under the disbelieving gazes of the motorman and the white passengers among whom she sat, the equally disbelieving stares of the blacks at the back. No we. No marching thousands. Only Rosalie Parks staring at a tidal wave with three words, I'm not moving. Odetta would think, if I could do something like that, if I could be that brave, I think I could be happy for the rest of my life. But that sort of courage is not in me. She had read of the Parks incident, but with little interest at first. That came little by little. It was hard to say exactly when or how her imagination had been caught and fired by that at first almost soundless racequake which had begun to shake the South. A year or so later, a young man she was dating more or less regularly began taking her down to the village where some of the young and mostly white folk singers who performed there had added some new and startling songs to their repertoire. Suddenly, in addition to all those old wheezes about how John Henry had taken his hammer and outtraced the new steam hammer, killing himself in the process, Lord, Lord, and how Barbary Allen had cruelly rejected her lovesick young suitor and ended up dying of shame, Lord, Lord, there were now songs about how it felt to be down and out and ignored in the city, how it felt to be turned away from a job you could no longer do because your skin was the wrong color, how it felt to be taken into a jail cell and whipped by Mr. Charlie because your skin was dark and you had dared, Lord, Lord, to sit in the white folks section of the lunch counter at the F.W. Woolworths in Montgomery, Alabama. Absurdly or not, it was only then that she had become curious about her own parents and their parents and their parents before them. She would never read Roots. She was in another world and time long before that book was written, perhaps ever even thought of by Alex Haley. But it was at this absurdly late time in her life when it first dawned upon her that not so many generations back, her progenitors had been taken in chains by white men. Surely the fact had occurred to her before, but only as a piece of information with no real temperature gradient, like an equation, never as something which bore intimately upon her own life. Odetta totted up what she knew, and was appalled by the smallness of the sum. She knew her mother had been born in Odetta, Arkansas, the town for which she, the only child, had been named. She knew her father had been a small town dentist who had invented and patented a capping process which had lain dormant and unremarked for 10 years, and which had then, suddenly, made him a moderately wealthy man. She knew that he had developed a number of other dental processes during the 10 years before and the 4 years after the influx of wealth, most of them either orthodontic or cosmetic in nature, and that shortly after moving to New York with his wife and daughter, who had been 4 years after the original patent had been secured, he had founded a company called Holmes Dental Industries, which was now to teeth what squib was to antibiotics. But when she asked him what life had been like during all the years between, the years when she hadn't been there, the years when she had, her father wouldn't tell her. He would say all sorts of things, but he wouldn't tell her anything. He closed that part of himself off to her. Once her ma, Alice, um, he called her ma sometimes, Allie, if he had a few or was feeling good, said, "Tell her about the time those men shot at you when you drove the Ford through the covered bridge, Dan." And he gave Odetta's ma such a gray and forbidding look that her ma, always something of a sparrow, had shrunk back in the seat and said no more. Odetta had tried her mother once or twice, alone after that night, but to no avail. If she had tried before, she might have gotten something, but because he wouldn't speak, she wouldn't speak either. And to him, she realized the past, those relatives, those red dirt roads, those stores, those dirt floor cabins with glassless windows ungraced by a single simple courtesy of curtain, those incidents of hurt and harassment, those neighbor children who went dressed in smocks which had begun life as flour sacks, all of that was for him buried away like dead teeth beneath perfect, blinding white caps. He would not speak, perhaps could not, had perhaps willingly afflicted himself with selective amnesia, that the capped teeth was their life in the gray marl apartments on Central Park South. All else was hidden beneath that impervious outer cover. His past was so well protected that there had been no gap to slide through, no way past that imperfect capped barrier and into the throat of revelation. Detta knew things, but Detta didn't know Odetta, and Odetta didn't know Detta. And so the teeth lay as smooth and as close as a reddened gate there also. She had some of her mother's shyness in her, as well as her father's unblinking, if unspoken, toughness, and the only time she had dared pursue him further on the subject to suggest that what he was denying her was a deserved trust fund never promised and apparently never to mature, had been one night in his library. He had shaken his Wall Street journal carefully, closed it, folded it, and laid it aside on the deal table beside the standing lamp. He had removed his rimless steel spectacles and had laid them on the top of the paper. Then he had looked at her. A thin black man, thin almost to the point of emaciation, tightly kinked gray hair now drawing rapidly away from the deepening hollows of his temples where tender clock springs of veins pulsed steadily. And he said only, "I don't talk about that part of my life, Odetta, or think about it. It would be pointless. The world has moved on since then." Roland would have understood. When Roland opened the door with the words, "The Lady of the Shadows," written upon it, he saw things he did not understand at all, but he understood they didn't matter. It was Eddie Dean's world, but beyond that it was only a confusion of lights, people, and objects, more objects than he had ever seen in his life, lady things from the look of them, and apparently for sale, some under glass, some arranged in tempting piles and displays. None of it mattered any more than the movement as that world flowed past the edges of the doorway before them. The doorway was the lady's eyes. He was looking through them just as he had looked through Eddie's eyes when Eddie had moved up the aisle of the sky carriage. Eddie, on the other hand, was thunderstruck. The revolver in his hand trembled and dropped a little, and the gunslinger could have taken it from him easily, but did not. He only stood quietly. It was a trick he had learned a long time ago. Now the view through the doorway made one of those turns the gunslinger found so dizzying, but Eddie found this same abrupt swoop oddly comforting. Roland had never seen a movie, but Eddie had seen thousands, and what he was looking at was like one of those moving point of view shots they did in ones like Halloween and The Shining. He even knew what they called the gadget they did it with. Steadicam. That was it. Star Wars, too, he muttered. Death Star. That fucking crack, remember? Roland looked at him and said nothing. Hands, dark brown hands, entered into what Roland saw as a doorway and what Eddie was already starting to think of as some sort of magic movie screen. A movie screen which, under the right circumstances, you might be able to walk into the way that guy had just walked out of the screen and into the real world in the Purple Rose of Cairo bitchin' movie. Eddie hadn't realized how bitchin' until just now. Except that movie hadn't been made yet on the other side of the door he was looking through. It was New York. Okay, somehow the very sound of the taxicab horns, as mute and faint as they were, proclaimed that. And it was some New York department store he had been in at one time or another, but it was. It's older, he muttered. Before your when? The gunslinger asked. Eddie looked at him and laughed shortly. Yeah, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. Hello, Miss Walker, a tentative voice asked. The view in the doorway rose so suddenly that Eddie was a bit dizzied, and he saw a saleswoman who obviously knew the owner of the Black Hands. Knew her, and either didn't like her or feared her or both. Help you today? This one, the owner of the Black Hands, held up a white scarf with a bright blue edge. Don't bother to wrap it up, babe. Just get in a bag. Cash or cash? It's always cash, isn't it? Yes, it's fine, Miss Walker. I'm so glad you approve, dear. There was a little grimace on the salesgirl face. Eddie just caught it as she turned away. Maybe it was something as simple as being talked to that way by a woman the salesgirl considered an uppity nizzle. Again, it was more his experience in movie theaters than any knowledge of history or even life on the streets as he had lived it that caused this thought, because this was like watching a movie either set or made in the 60s, something like that one with Sidney Steigler and Rod Poitier, In the Heat of the Night. But it could also be something even simpler. Roland's Lady of the Shadows was black or white, one rude bitch. And it didn't really matter, did it? None of it made a damned bit of difference. He cared about one thing and one thing only, and that was getting the fuck out. That was New York. He could almost smell New York. And New York meant smack. He could almost smell that too. Except there was a hitch, wasn't there? One big motherfucker of a hitch. Roland watched Eddie carefully, and although he could have killed him 6 times over at almost any time he wanted, he had elected to remain still and silent and let Eddie work the situation out for himself. Eddie was a lot of things, and a lot of them were not nice, as a fellow who had consciously let a child drop to his death. The gunslinger knew the difference between nice and not quite well. But one thing Eddie wasn't was stupid. He was a smart kid. He would figure it out. So he did. He looked back at Roland, smiled without showing his teeth, twirled the gunslinger's revolver once on his finger, clumsily, burlesquing a show shooter's fantasy coda, and then he held it out to Roland, but first. This thing might as well be a piece of shit for all the good it can do me. Isn't that right? You can talk bright when you want to, Roland thought. Why do you so often choose to talk stupid, Eddie? Is it because you think that's the way they talk in the place where your brother went with his guns? Isn't that right? Eddie repeated. Roland nodded. If I had plugged you, what would have happened to the door? I don't know. I suppose the only way to find out would be to try it and see. Well, what do you think would happen? I think it would disappear. Eddie nodded. That's what he thought too. Proof. Poof. Gone like magic. Now you see it, my friends. Now you don't. It was really no different than what would happen if the projectionist in a movie theater were to draw a 6-shooter and plug the projector, was it? If you shot the projector, the movie stopped. Eddie didn't want the picture to stop. Eddie wanted his money's worth. You can go through by yourself, Eddie said slowly. Yes? Sort of, yes. You wind up in her head, like you wound up in mine. Yes. So you can hitchhike into my world, but that's all. Roland said nothing. Hitchhike was one of the words Eddie sometimes used that he didn't exactly understand, but he caught the drift. But you could go through in your body, like at Balazar's. He was talking out loud, but really talking to himself. Except you'd need me for that, wouldn't you? Yes. Then take me with you. The gunslinger opened his mouth, but Eddie was already rushing on. Not now, I don't mean now, he said. I know I would cause a riot or some goddamn thing if we just popped out over there. He laughed rather wildly, like a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat, except without any hat. Sure, I did. Well, wait. Like a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat, except without any hat. Sure, I did. We'll wait until she's alone and. No. I'll come back with you, Eddie said. I swear it, Roland. I mean, I know you got a job to do, and I know I'm part of it. I know you've saved my ass at customs, but I think I saved yours at Balazar's, and now, what do you think? I think you did, Roland said. He remembered the way Eddie had risen up from behind the desk, regardless of the risk, and felt an instant of doubt. But only an instant. So, Peter pays Paul. One hand washes the other. All I want to do is go back for a few hours. Grab some takeout chicken, maybe a box of Dunkin' Donuts. Eddie nodded toward the doorway, where things had begun to move again. So what do you say? No, the gunslinger said. But for a moment he was hardly thinking about Eddie. That movement up the aisle, the lady, whoever she was, wasn't moving the way an ordinary person moved. Wasn't moving, for instance, the way Eddie had moved when Roland looked through his eyes. Or, now that he stopped to think of it, which he never had before any more than he had ever stopped and really noticed the constant presence of his own nose in the lower range of his peripheral vision, the way he moved himself. When one walked, vision became a mild pendulum. Left leg, right leg, left leg, right leg, the world rocking back and forth so mildly and gently that after a while, shortly after you began to walk, he supposed, you simply ignore it. There was none of that pendulum movement in the lady's walk. She simply moved smoothly up the aisle as if riding along tracks. Ironically, Eddie had had this same perception, only to Eddie it had looked like a Steadicam shot. He had found this perception comforting because it was familiar. To Roland it was alien. But now Eddie was breaking in, his voice shrill. Well, why not? Just why the fuck not? Because you don't want chicken, the gunslinger said. I know what you call the things you want, Eddie. You want to fix. You want to score. So what? Eddie cried, almost shrieked. So what if I do? I said I'd come back with you. You got my promise. You got my fucking promise. What else do you want? You want me to swear on my mother's name? Okay, I swear on my mother's name. You want me to swear on my brother Henry's name? All right, I swear. I swear. I swear. Enrico Balazar would have told him. But would have told him Slinger didn't need the likes of Balazar to tell him this one fact of life. Never trust a junkie. Roland nodded to the door. Until after the tower, at least, that part of your life is done. After that, I don't care. After that, you're free to go to hell in your own way. Until then, I need you. Oh, you fucking shit-ass liar, Eddie said softly. There was no audible emotion in his voice, but the gunslinger saw the glisten of tears in his eyes. Roland said nothing. You know there ain't gonna be no after? Not for me, not for her, or whoever the Christ this third guy is. Probably not for you, either. You look as fucking wasted as Henry did at his worst. If we don't die on the way to your tower, we'll sure as shit die when we get there. So why are you lying to me? The gunslinger felt a dull species of shame, but only repeated, at least for now, that part of your life is done. Yeah? Eddie said. Well, I got some news for you, Roland. I know what's going to happen to your real body when you go through there and inside of her. I know, because I saw it before. I don't need your guns. I got you by the fabled place where the short hairs grow, my friend. You can. You can even turn her head the way you turned mine, and watch what I do to the rest of you while you're nothing but your goddamn caw. I'd like to wait until nightfall and drag you down by the water. Then you could watch the lobsters chow up on the rest of you. But you might be in too much of a hurry for that. Eddie paused. The grady breaking of the waves and the steady, hollow conch of the wind both seemed very loud. So I think I'll just use your knife to cut your throat and close that door forever. You say that part of my life is done? You don't just mean smack either. You mean New York, America, my time, everything. And if that's how it is, I want this part done too. The scenery sucks and the company stinks. There are times, Roland, when you make Jimmy Swaggart look almost sane. There are great wonders ahead, Roland said. Great adventures. More than that, there is a quest to course upon, and a chance to redeem your honor. There's something else, too. You could be a gunslinger. I needn't be the last after all. It's in you, Eddie. I see it. I feel it. Eddie laughed, although now the tears were coursing down his cheeks. Oh, wonderful! Wonderful! Just what I need. My brother Henry. He was a gunslinger, in a place called Vietnam, that was. It was great for him. You should have seen him when he was on a serious nod, Roland. He couldn't find his way to the fucking bathroom without help. If there wasn't any help handy, he would just sit there and watch the big time wrestling and did it in his fucking pants. It's great to be a gunslinger. I can see that. My brother was a doper, and you're out of your fucking gourd. Perhaps your brother was a man with no clear idea of honor. Maybe not. We didn't always get real clear picture of what that was in the projects. It was just a word you used after your if you happened to get caught smoking reefer or lifting the spinners off some guy's T-bird and got hoed up in court for it. Eddie was crying harder now, but he was laughing too. Your friends, now, this guy you talked about in your sleep, for instance, this dude Cuthbert, the gunslinger started in spite of himself. Not all his long years of training could stay that start. Did they get this stuff you're talking about? Like a goddamn Marine recruiting sergeant? Adventure, quests, honor. They understood honor, yes, Roland said slowly, thinking of all the vanished others. Did it get them any farther than gunslinging got my brother? The gunslinger said nothing. I know you, Eddie said. I seen lots of guys like you. You're just another kook singing Onward Christian Soldiers with a flag in one hand and a gun in the other. I don't want no honor. I just want a chicken dinner and a fix. In that order. So I'm telling you, you go through. You can. But the minute you're gone, I'ma kill the rest of you. Gunslinger said nothing. Eddie smiled crookedly and brushed the tears from his cheeks with the back of his hands. You want to know what we call this back home? What? A Mexican standoff. For a moment they only looked at each other, and then Roland looked sharply into the doorway. They had both been partially aware, Roland rather more than Eddie, that there had been another of those swerves, this time to the left. Here was an array of sparkling jewelry. Some was under protective glass, but because most wasn't, the gunslinger supposed it was trumpery stuff, what Eddie would have called costume jewelry. The dark brown hands examined a few things in what seemed an only cursory manner, and then another salesgirl appeared. There had been some conversation which neither of them really noticed, and the lady, some lady, Eddie thought, asked to see something else. The salesgirl went away, and that was when Roland's eyes swung sharply back. The brown hands reappeared, only now they held a purse. It opened, and suddenly the hands were scooping things, seemingly, almost certainly, at random, into that purse. Well, you're collecting quite a crew, Roland, Eddie said, bitterly amused. First you got your basic white junkie, and then you got your basic black shoplift. But Roland was already moving toward the doorway between the worlds, moving swiftly, not looking at Eddie at all. I mean it, Eddie screamed. You go through and I'll cut your throat. I'll cut your fucking throat. Before he could finish, the gunslinger was gone. All that was left of him was his limp, breathing body lying upon the beach. For a moment, Eddie only stood there, unable to believe that Roland had done it, had really gone ahead and done this idiotic thing in spite of his promise, his sincere fucking guarantee, as far as that went, of what the consequences would be. He stood for a moment, eyes rolling like the eyes of a frightened horse at the onset of a thunderstorm, except of course there was no thunderstorm, except for the one in his head. All right, God damn it. There might only be a moment. That was all the gunslinger might give him, and Eddie damn well knew it. He glanced at the door and saw the black hands freeze with a golden necklace half in and half out of the purse that already glittered like a pirate cache of treasure. Although he could not hear it, Eddie sensed that Roland was speaking to the owner of the black hands. He pulled the knife from the gunslinger's purse and then rolled over the limp, breathing body which lay before the doorway. The eyes were open but blank, rolled up to the whites. Watch, Roland! Eddie screamed. That monotonous, idiotic. Eddie screamed. That monotonous, idiotic, never-ending wind blew in his ears. Christ, it was enough to drive anyone bug shit. Watch very closely. I want to complete your fucking education. I want to show you what happens when you fuck over the Dean brothers. He brought the knife down to the gunslinger's throat. How long have I been reading? What does it say? Almost 2 hours. But it's so long. We're a little over halfway through this book now. If I stop here, where would I go to next time? And how about the people out, if you guys, some of you don't want to talk, and that's fine. But for those who talk, is that a good stopping point, or should we go another chapter? I'm trying to see, the thing is, like, if I go another chapter, okay, if I stop here, then next week we finish The Lady of the Shadows. And then the week after that, we'll get into Reshuffle. If I don't stop here, it's going to break those up. Like, we'll finish Lady of the Shadows, but we'll probably go into Reshuffle and not finish Reshuffle. Does that make sense? So I guess... Yeah, as much as I don't want to, just because I know how long this series is, as much as I don't want to stop, I think this, like, for consistency and just to keep the story cohesive, I think this might be actually the best place to stop tonight. Yeah. So we'll stop here. And when time allows, I might start doing more than one a week. Like, not consistently, right? It's not going to be like, oh, there's 2 every week. But I might, like, throw in an extra one here and there as I have time, just because this is such a long series. So if something pops up out of nowhere and it's not the usual Saturday or something, please, that is just to get through this, because everything's so long. I might throw in extra ones here and there, if you guys don't mind. If you would rather me just stick to once a week, that's fine. So please let me know. Again, circling back to the beginning of this stream, for those who are interested, I will say, when I say interactive, if I can get 9 to 10 people, and that's a big if. I understand I have a long time to do it, but that is a big if. If I can get 9 to 10 people, I'm thinking of doing a book sort of like an old radio show. Does that make sense? So, like, different characters will have different voices. If I get 9 people, I will have to be a character, but if I can get 10 people, if I can get 10 people to participate with me, I would be the narrator. And so I think it sounds like fun. I think it would be great to do, and I think it would be even more entertaining for my book club people. But I don't know. It's a long way away. We got to finish this series first, and I don't know if I can get that many participants. Um, when we get closer, I'll give the name of the book I'm thinking about. That book can change if the majority of people want it to change. That's just the book that I thought would be fun to do it with. But on that note, thank you for coming in, Pretty Shiny Peoples. And I'm going to end it here. But like I said, I'll probably come back and stream in like, I don't know, like an hour or so. I'll probably come back and stream today. Um, and if you want to come join me, I might be laughing at someone. And I should feel bad. Like, part of me should feel bad for laughing at this person, but I don't. And I'm going to do it again. So yeah, I'll see you pretty shiny peoples later. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. Thank you for those who comment. Special thank you for those who leave likes. Um, please have fun and do not forget to smile.